She has never faced real war. She just flies a video game from 30,000 feet. My father said it to my 17-year-old cousin who was thinking about enlisting, right in the middle of our family reunion. I let it go. I always let it go. But this time, the Air Force did not. By Friday, a general would say my name in a room full of brass, and my father would have to listen. To understand how we got there, I have to go back. My name is Sarah. I am 36 years old, and I have spent the last 14 years of my life wearing the uniform of the United States Air Force. I currently hold the rank of Major. My daily office is the cockpit of an F-35A Lightning II fighter jet. We operate out of Hill Air Force Base, a massive installation nestled right up against the Wasatch Mountains in northern Utah. In my profession, we don't rely on luck. We rely on physics, geometry, and a rigid adherence to checklists. We have a saying in aviation: slow is smooth, smooth is fast. You don't react with sudden emotion when you are strapped to a multi-million-dollar engine pulling 9 times the force of gravity. You assess. You verify. You execute. Facts over feelings. I carry that same discipline home with me. I have to, especially when dealing with my father. My father was drafted into the United States Army in 1968. He was 19 years old when he landed in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. He served as an infantryman. He walked point through triple canopy jungles, slept in flooded fighting holes, and watched his friends bleed into the red dirt. He came home to a country that didn't want to look at him, let alone thank him. He carried the physical scars of shrapnel in his left knee and the invisible weight of a war he survived, but never entirely left behind. I hold a profound, unshakable respect for my father and the men he served alongside. They endured a brutal reality, but trauma has a funny way of calcifying into pride. As I grew up and eventually earned my own commission, I realized my father needed his suffering to remain exclusive. To him, real war meant mud on your boots and a rifle in your hands. If you didn't sleep in a trench, if you had access to a hot meal, or if you slept in a bed with clean sheets, you weren't actually in the military. You were basically a corporate employee wearing a costume. And as his daughter, entering a combat aviation role that did not even exist for women when he served, his dismissal carried a unique, quiet sting. I never argued with him. Not because he was right, but because I knew what his suffering had cost him. Sometimes you defend your pride. Sometimes you protect a fragile older man who needs to believe his sacrifices are completely unique. I always chose the latter. I absorbed his quiet jabs and moved on, until late August of last year. We were hosting our annual family reunion at my house. It was a Saturday afternoon. The Utah heat was dry and baking, and the Wasatch Mountains stood sharp and pale in the distance. The backyard was crowded with aunts, uncles, and cousins. The charcoal grill was smoking. Aluminum lawn chairs dotted the grass, and the distant low rumble of fighter jets climbing out from the base provided a familiar background hum. I was standing near the patio cooler with my cousin Tyler. Tyler had just turned 17. He was a bright kid, athletic, but drifting a bit as he approached his senior year of high school. For the past 6 months, he and I had been talking quietly about his future. He was seriously considering enlisting. He was full of questions about the discipline, the commitment, and what it actually meant to take the oath. I was giving him the honest truth. I was explaining that the military will test you in ways you cannot anticipate, but it will also give you a brotherhood that you will carry forever. Tyler was hanging on every word. Then a shadow fell over us. My father walked up holding a cold can of soda. He wore his faded green field jacket despite the heat, a stubborn habit of his. He stood behind Tyler and listened to me talk for about 30 seconds. Then he laughed. It was a sharp, scraping sound that cut right through the noise of the party. He put a heavy hand on Tyler's shoulder and pointed his other hand at me. "Don't listen to the Major, Tyler," my father said, his voice loud enough to carry across the patio. "If you want to know what the military is, you talk to an infantryman. You put your boots in the dirt. You don't sit in an air-conditioned briefing room." Tyler looked uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from foot to foot. "I was just asking about her deployments, Uncle," Tyler mumbled. My father shook his head, a patronizing smile on his face. That was when he delivered the line. "She has never faced real war," my father told the teenager, gesturing to me as if I were a prop. "She just flies a video game from 30,000 feet. It is a simulator ride. She drops a bomb from miles away, flies back to base, and eats at a dining facility. She doesn't know what it means to look out for the guy next to you, while the world is trying to kill you." The patio went completely silent. My husband stopped gathering paper plates at the picnic table. A few relatives suddenly looked down at their shoes. Tyler just stood there, caught in the crossfire, completely embarrassed. My father looked right at me, his chin tilted up. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted to litigate whose war was harder. He was diminishing my career in front of the kid I was mentoring to validate his own past. I felt a sudden hot spike of anger in my chest. I could have told him about the smell of aviation fuel and cold sweat in a cockpit. I could have explained what it feels like to fly through contested airspace in the dead of night, trusting nothing but your instruments, while anti-aircraft fire lights up the sky below you. I could have told him that the terrified voices of 19-year-old kids screaming for air support on a scrambled radio sound exactly the same today as they did 50 years ago. I didn't. I looked at his worn face, and I chose peace over being right. I simply looked at Tyler and told him we could talk more about the recruiting process later. Then I turned back to the grill. My father scoffed, completely satisfied that he had won a battle I refused to fight. He patted Tyler on the back and walked away to hold court with my uncles, painting his picture of warfare that left no room for anyone else. Therefore, for the rest of the afternoon, I watched from a distance as my cousin gravitated toward my father. I had been reduced to a clerk in my own backyard. I let it go. By nightfall, the house was quiet. The relatives had gone to their hotels, my husband was asleep, and I was standing alone in the dark kitchen wiping down the counters. I told myself it didn't matter. I knew what I had done. My squadron knew what I had done. But the universe has a funny way of balancing the scales when you refuse to do it yourself. My cell phone vibrated on the granite island. I looked at the glowing screen. It was 20 minutes past midnight. The caller identification showed the name of my squadron commander. In military aviation, a phone call from the boss at midnight never means good news. It means a schedule change, an international crisis, or an immediate deployment. I dried my hands with a dish towel and picked up the phone. I had no idea that the voice on the other end of the line was about to shatter my silent endurance and force a conversation I had avoided for 14 years. "Major," a voice said. It was my squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harris. His tone was perfectly level, but it carried a specific gravity. It was not the fast, clipped cadence of an emergency recall. It was something heavier, something deliberate. I leaned against the cool granite of my kitchen counter, watching the moonlight spill across the hardwood floor. Just hours earlier, my father had stood on my patio and confidently told my teenage cousin that my career was nothing more than a glorified video game. My father believed that because I did not sleep in a flooded trench, I did not know the cost of war. He thought the jet did all the work. He assumed I simply pressed buttons in a sanitized, air-conditioned bubble. Let me tell you what that simulator actually feels like. When you fly the F-35A Lightning II in a combat theater, there is no pause menu. There is no reset button. You are strapped into an ejection seat barely wider than your own shoulders. You wear a heavy flight suit, a survival vest packed with gear, and a custom helmet that becomes a suffocating anchor on your cervical spine the moment the aircraft maneuvers. When you pull into a steep defensive turn to evade a threat or line up a strike, you experience the physical crushing weight of gravity. At 9 times the force of gravity, a 150-pound pilot suddenly weeds over 1,300 pounds. The blood rushes frantically toward your feet. To keep from blacking out and flying 30,000 pounds of metal into the earth at 600 miles per hour, your anti-gravity suit inflates with a violent, bruising pressure against your legs and abdomen. You have to forcefully strain your core and push air past your vocal cords in short, brutal hiccups just to keep oxygen in your brain. You do this while managing 3 separate radio frequencies. You monitor a digital airspace saturated with friendlies and enemies. You check fuel consumption down to the pound, and you watch for the distinct, terrifying radar signature of a surface-to-air missile locking onto your aircraft. It is a violently physical environment. You return from a mission with burst capillaries in your shoulders, a bruised rib cage, and a spine that aches for days. But my father only saw the pristine flight suit. He only saw the manicured lawns of the base when he visited. If you have ever had your hardest, most terrifying professional moments reduced to a joke by someone who simply could not comprehend them, you know exactly how isolating that silence can be. If you believe some battles are won by simply refusing to fight them, hit the like button. It is a heavy thing to carry, and I carried it because I understood why my father needed it. He came back from Vietnam to a deeply divided country. There were no parades. He stepped off a commercial airliner in uniform and was advised to change into civilian clothes in an airport bathroom so he would not be targeted. He carried the horrors of the jungle completely alone. His belief that his war was the only real war was the armor he wore to survive his own memories. If everyone else's service was a corporate desk job, then his horrific suffering meant something profound. I loved him too much to shatter his armor. Letting him call my career a video game was the tax I paid to keep his pride intact. "Major, are you still there?" my commander asked, pulling me back to the dark kitchen. I cleared my throat. "Yes, sir, I am here." "I know it is late," Lieutenant Colonel Harris said, "but the flash traffic just came down from the Pentagon. I wanted you to hear it from me before the official email goes out on Monday." My stomach tightened. In the military, a late-night call about Pentagon traffic usually meant an administrative disaster or a sudden deployment order. "What is the traffic, sir?" I asked. "The review board finished their audit of the classified after-action reports from last winter," he replied. "The mission over the valley. The operation has been officially declassified." I stopped breathing for a second. I knew exactly which mission he meant. It was a close air support mission we had not been allowed to talk about. Not to our spouses, not to our friends, and certainly not to our fathers at a summer barbecue. I remembered the pitch-black sky. I remembered the dizzying green glow of my night vision. But most of all, I remembered the voices coming through my headset. They were American infantrymen, heavily outnumbered, pinned down in a rocky valley, taking sustained machine gun fire from elevated positions. The voice of their radio operator was cracking with terror. He sounded exactly the way my father must have sounded in the Central Highlands of Vietnam in 1968. I could not tell anyone what had happened that night. I could not tell them how I had pushed my aircraft to the absolute breaking point. I could not tell them about the bingo fuel warning screaming in my headset, or the terrifying geometry of keeping the jet between the enemy fire and the trapped platoon. "Declassified?" I asked softly. "Yes," the commander said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Which means the awards package cleared the final hurdle. The recommendation was approved at the absolute highest level. Sarah, you are being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with the Valor device. I leaned heavily against the granite island, the cool stone grounding me. The Distinguished Flying Cross is not a deployment ribbon. It is one of the highest aviation honors in the military, awarded for heroism or extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. The Valor device meant it was specifically for combat. Thank you, sir, I finally managed to whisper. I am deeply honored. You can just pin it on me in the squadron room on Monday. In the military, we usually prefer quiet recognition. A firm handshake in the hallway, a quick reading of the orders, and then right back to the flight schedule. That is how I wanted it. I just wanted the ribbon filed in my official military personnel record. That is not going to happen, he said flatly. That is the other reason I am calling. The wing commander caught wind of the approval. Brigadier General Vance. My heart sank. General Vance was a legendary combat pilot. He was also a man who believed in public accountability and military tradition above all else. The general read the unredacted mission report, my boss continued. He said putting this medal on you in a back room would be a disservice to the uniform. He is mandating a full, formal presentation on Friday afternoon in the main hangar. Dress blues. The entire wing will be in attendance. I squeezed my eyes shut, rubbing my forehead. Sir, please, my family is in town. I know, he ordered gently. Bring them. All of them. Especially your father. I gripped the edge of the counter. Sir, the general noted your father's army service in your biography, Lieutenant Colonel Harris said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. He was very specific. This is a direct order, Major. He wants your family in the front row. He wants our community to see what our people are actually doing out there. The line went quiet. He hung up. I stood in my kitchen staring at the blank screen of my phone. The clock was ticking. I had exactly 5 days to look my father in the eye and invite him to a formal military ceremony, knowing perfectly well he would view it as nothing more than a bureaucratic participation award. The morning after the phone call, the Utah sun was already baking the concrete patio. Most of my relatives were packing their rental cars, preparing to fly home. My father, however, was staying for the rest of the week. I found him sitting in an aluminum lawn chair in the backyard, nursing a cup of black coffee. He was still wearing his faded olive drab jacket. My teenage cousin Tyler was sitting on the steps nearby, scrolling on his phone. I walked out through the sliding glass door. I had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times since midnight. Dad, I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I need you to clear your schedule for this Friday afternoon. He did not look away from the mountains. Your mother and I were going to take Tyler up to Park City on Friday. We fly out Saturday morning. We will have to go to Park City on Saturday before your flight, I said. There is a mandatory event on base, at the main hangar. My commanding officer has ordered me to have my family present. That got his attention. He slowly turned his head, peering at me. Ordered to a family event. He let out a short, dismissive breath. What kind of corporate nonsense is the Air Force pulling now? Mandatory fun day? Are they handing out certificates for perfectly filed paperwork? I gripped my coffee mug tightly. It is an awards ceremony. He scoffed. He actually scoffed. He leaned back in his chair with the exhausted patience of an old man explaining a simple concept to a child. Sarah, he said, tapping a finger against his coffee mug. I know how your generation operates. They hand out ribbons for showing up. They give you a medal for completing a training module and another one for not getting a sunburn on a deployment. When I was in the infantry, they did not hand out medals unless you were bleeding or unless you dragged a bleeding man through the mud. He crossed his arms, glancing at Tyler to make sure the kid was listening. So, he continued, If this is some bureaucratic work thing, some pat on the back for managing logistics or successfully logging 1,000 hours in the simulator, I am going to pass. I am not putting on a tie to sit in a folding chair and watch officers congratulate each other for sitting behind a desk. I looked at the man who had raised me. I saw the deep lines around his eyes carved by years of quiet suffering. I saw the pride that had kept him upright when the world had turned its back on him. But for the very first time, I also saw the sheer blinding arrogance of his assumption. He was not just being stubborn. He was gatekeeping valor. He needed his war to be the only real war because it was the only way his trauma meant anything. If my service was real, if my combat was real, it threatened the exclusive pedestal he had built for himself. If this had been any other day, I would have nodded, apologized for the inconvenience, and let him keep his armor. But I thought about the terrified 19-year-old infantryman on the radio that night in the valley. And I thought about my cousin Tyler, who was absorbing every toxic word my father said. "It is not a participation ribbon, Dad," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "And it is not a request. The wing commander issued a direct order for my family to be in the front row. You are my father. You will put on a suit. You will sit in the chair, and you will be there." My father stared at me. He was genuinely taken aback. I had never spoken to him with that kind of command presence in my entire life. I had never pulled rank in my own house. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in my posture stopped him. "Fine," he muttered, looking away. "If your general is making it a mandate, I will come to your paperwork party." He thought he had the last word. He thought he knew exactly what was going to happen on Friday. He assumed we would stand in a carpeted auditorium, a staff officer would read a paragraph full of corporate jargon about efficiency and readiness, and we would all eat stale sheet cake in the lobby. He had absolutely no idea. Because what my father did not know, and what the unredacted mission report held, was the exact nature of what I had done over that valley. I had not just dropped a bomb from 30,000 feet and flown home to a hot meal. 7 months earlier, I was flying a routine combat air patrol when a distress call broke through the radio static. An American Army infantry platoon had been ambushed during a night movement in a steep, rocky ravine. The enemy had the high ground on both sides, utilizing heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The soldiers were completely surrounded, rapidly running out of ammunition and taking heavy casualties. The ground commander was screaming for immediate close air support. When I reached the target area, the weather had degraded rapidly. A massive storm front had pushed in, dropping the cloud ceiling to an incredibly dangerous altitude. To actually see the enemy positions and protect those American soldiers, I had to drop below the weather layer. I intentionally flew my F-35A into the narrow canyon, placing myself in the direct line of sight of enemy anti-aircraft weapons. I held station. I flew tight, violent orbits just a few thousand feet above the ground, pulling maximum gravity completely exposed to ground fire. I refused to leave the airspace. I became the biggest target in the sky, drawing the heavy machine gun fire away from the trapped men on the ground. My fuel hit critical levels. The warning alarms were screaming in my helmet, but if I left, the platoon would have been overrun in minutes. So I stayed. I held my position under sustained fire until the extraction helicopters finally broke through the weather and pulled every single soldier out of that valley. But I could not tell my father that. The truth would have to come from an authority he could not dismiss. The days dragged on. The tension in the house was suffocating. Every time my father walked past my uniform hanging in the hallway, he gave it a small, pitying look. Finally, Friday morning arrived. I woke up before dawn. I meticulously pressed my dress blue uniform. I shined my shoes until they reflected the bedroom light. I checked my ribbons, ensuring they were perfectly aligned, down to the millimeter. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, it was time to leave for the base. I stood in my driveway, the Utah sun beating down on the asphalt. My husband was already loading our car. Tyler was sitting in the back seat wearing a borrowed tie. I checked my watch. We were exactly 5 minutes from our departure deadline. My father's rental car was parked in the driveway, but the front door of my house remained closed. I stood there feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The general was expecting my family in the front row. If my father refused to walk out that door, if his pride finally won out over his obligation to his daughter, I would have to stand in front of the entire wing and explain why the chairs were empty. I watched the second hand on my watch sweep past the 12. I realized, with a sudden sinking dread, that my father might actually be a no-show. I stared at the closed front door of my house, the second hand on my watch sweeping past the 12. 1 minute past departure time. 2 minutes passed. My husband sat in the driver's seat of our car, the engine idling. My cousin Tyler was in the back seat, wearing a stiff collared shirt and a borrowed tie. Tyler looked nervously out the window. He knew the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Just as I took a step toward the porch, completely prepared to march inside and drag my father out by his collar, the heavy wooden door swung open. My father stepped out into the blinding Utah sunlight. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked at least 20 years old, the lapels slightly too wide, the fabric stiff. He tugged uncomfortably at a plain red tie, his jaw set in a hard, resentful line. He did not look at me. He just walked straight to the back door of our car, opened it, and got in next to Tyler. I let out a slow breath. He was coming. I climbed into the passenger seat. The trip to Hill Air Force Base took less than 20 minutes, but the silence inside the car made it feel like hours. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioner. As we approached the main gate, the sprawling reality of the base came into view. To a civilian or an infantryman from 1968, an Air Force base does not immediately look like a war zone. You see perfectly paved roads, neatly trimmed lawns, brick administration buildings, and a golf course near the perimeter. We pulled up to the security checkpoint. The young security forces defender checked our identification cards, stepped back, and offered a sharp, textbook salute. "Good afternoon, Major," the defender said crisply. I returned the salute, and my husband drove us through the gate. From the back seat, my father let out a quiet, sarcastic hum. He was looking out the window at the pristine landscaping around the headquarters building. "Very nice," my father muttered. "Looks like a country club. I bet the fairways are in great shape. Must be tough fighting a war from a desk overlooking a putting green." I squeezed my eyes shut for a second. "We are heading to the flight line, Dad. Hangar 4. My husband navigated the sprawling base, eventually turning onto the long, flat stretch of concrete that bordered the active runway. We parked in a massive lot near a towering gray steel hangar. We walked across the tarmac in the shimmering afternoon heat. My father trailed slightly behind us, completely unbothered, acting as if he were attending a mandatory safety briefing he had absolutely zero interest in. Then we stepped through the heavy side doors into Hangar 4. The atmosphere hit us like a physical wall. The hangar was cavernous, smelling faintly of jet fuel and hot metal. A massive American flag was draped from the heavy steel rafters. Directly in the center of the bay, perfectly polished and dominating the space, was an F-35A Lightning II fighter jet. But it was not the aircraft that made my father stop dead in his tracks. It was the people. The hangar was completely packed. There were nearly 1,000 airmen in attendance. Entire squadrons were formed up in perfect, motionless ranks on the concrete floor. Every officer, every enlisted airman was wearing immaculately pressed dress blue uniforms. The sheer amount of polished silver gleaming brass and heavy combat ribbons in the room was overwhelming. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and deeply respectful. There was no casual chatter, There were no plastic chairs or paper certificates. This was not a bureaucratic work thing. This was a combat wing standing at attention. I watched my father's face change. The sarcastic, dismissive expression vanished instantly. His eyes widened as he took in the sheer mass of the formation, the precise lines of polished shoes, and the severe, unsmiling faces of the senior leadership standing near the front. He instinctively stood a little straighter. The old infantryman in him recognized a battle formation when he saw one. A young captain with an aiguillette corps looped over his shoulder rushed over to us. "Major," the captain whispered respectfully, rendering a crisp salute. "The general is waiting. Family seating is right up front." I returned the salute and turned to my family. "Follow the captain." I watched as the captain led my husband Tyler and my father down the center aisle. Hundreds of pairs of eyes followed them. My father walked stiffly, his eyes scanning the rows of seasoned combat veterans, the flight suits, and the serious faces of the men and women he had so easily dismissed just a few hours earlier. The captain led them to a row of padded chairs placed directly in front of the aircraft, right at the edge of a raised wooden stage. My father sat down slowly, looking around the room, clearly trying to process why an entire combat wing had ceased operations just to watch his daughter get a participation award. I left them and walked to my designated mark near the side of the stage, standing at the position of attention. A sharp, booming voice echoed through the hangar's public address system. "Wing attention." 1,000 pairs of heels clicked together simultaneously, a single, deafening crack that reverberated off the steel walls like a gunshot. My father jumped slightly in his chair. Tyler sat up perfectly straight, his eyes wide. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice announced, "the commander of the 388th Fighter Wing." Brigadier General Vance strode out from behind the aircraft and walked onto the stage. General Vance was a tall, imposing man who had flown combat sorties in 3 different decades. His uniform was heavy with medals earned in skies most people could not even point to on a map. He carried an air of absolute, uncompromising authority. He stepped up to the wooden podium, looking out over the silent sea of blue uniforms. He did not smile. He did not offer a warm corporate greeting. He did not make a joke about the Utah heat. "Take your seats," the general commanded. The wing sat down in perfect unison. The general looked out over the crowd, and then he slowly turned his head and looked directly down at the front row. He locked eyes with my father. For a long, silent moment, the battle-tested general and the Vietnam infantryman stared at each other. My father swallowed hard, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The general broke the gaze. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a set of meticulously typed index cards. These were his prepared introductory remarks, the safe, sanitized, heavily vetted speech about readiness training and logistical excellence. General Vance looked at the cards. Then he deliberately dropped them onto the floor of the stage. He reached beneath the podium and pulled out a dark blue leather-bound folder. The hangar was so quiet, I could hear the faint whistling of the wind outside the steel doors. My father leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He had expected an office manager handing out a certificate. He was surrounded by warriors, and the highest-ranking man in the room was going completely off script. General Vance opened the blue folder, revealing a single unredacted sheet of paper, and leaned into the microphone. "Attention to orders!" The general's voice boomed through the massive space, amplified by the heavy acoustics of the hangar. The command was a reflex for anyone who had ever served. In a fraction of a second, the entire wing snapped to rigid attention. The sharp crack of 1,000 boots hitting the concrete floor echoed like a gunshot. I stood completely motionless near the edge of the stage, my eyes fixed straight ahead. My husband stood up. Tyler jumped to his feet, his eyes wide with anticipation. My father, recognizing a command he had not heard in decades, pushed himself up from his padded chair, his posture suddenly stiff and expectant. "The President of the United States," the general announced, his tone deliberate and heavy, "takes great pleasure in presenting the Distinguished Flying Cross with the Valor Device to Major Sarah Miller for extraordinary heroism while participating in aerial flight." I watched my father's face out of the corner of my eye. He knew exactly what the Valor Device meant. It was a small bronze letter V pinned to the center of the ribbon. It was not a participation award. It was not a commendation for logistical efficiency or perfectly filed paperwork. It meant direct, hostile engagement with an enemy force. It meant someone had tried to kill you, and you had fought back. General Vance bypassed the sanitized public affairs version of the story. He recited the raw, classified after-action report. On the night of January 14th, the general's voice echoed off the steel walls. Major Miller was operating an F-35A Lightning II over heavily contested territory. At 2200 hours, a frantic distress call was received from an American Army infantry platoon. At the word infantry, my father stopped breathing. His jaw tightened. The platoon had been ambushed during a night movement in a steep, heavily fortified ravine, the general stated, his voice cutting through the silent hangar. They were surrounded, completely outnumbered, and taking sustained, accurate fire from elevated enemy positions on both ridgelines. Tyler stared up at the general in total shock, completely unable to reconcile the cousin who grilled hot dogs in the backyard with the violent reality of what he was hearing. My father was staring at the podium. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He was not in a hangar in Utah anymore. He was back in the Central Highlands of 1968. He was remembering the terrifying rhythmic crack of rifle fire echoing through a jungle valley. He was remembering what it felt like to be pinned down in the mud in the pitch black, praying desperately for an angel on the radio to save his life. "The ground commander declared a tactical emergency," General Vance continued. "However, a severe storm system had pushed into the valley, forcing the cloud ceiling down to a perilous altitude, rendering standard high-altitude close air support absolutely impossible. To visually acquire the enemy and protect the trapped ground forces, Major Miller made a deliberate decision to descend below the weather layer, flying her aircraft directly into the narrow confines of the canyon." A low, collective murmur rippled through the ranks of the combat pilots standing in the hangar. They understood the sheer, terrifying danger of taking a fast-moving jet into a narrow, unmapped canyon at night in zero visibility. By descending into the valley, Major Miller intentionally placed her aircraft in the direct line of sight of multiple enemy anti-aircraft systems, the general said, executing violent, high-gravity orbits mere thousands of feet above the ground. She became the primary target for enemy fire, purposefully drawing the barrage away from the trapped infantrymen. My father's hands began to shake. He gripped the back of the empty chair in front of him so hard, his knuckles turned white. Despite receiving critical fuel warnings and sustaining enemy engagement, Major Miller refused to abandon her station, the general declared, his voice tight with undeniable respect. She held her position in the canyon under constant fire for 47 minutes. She provided devastating suppression fire and did not leave the contested airspace until extraction helicopters arrived and successfully evacuated every single American soldier. General Vance slowly closed the blue leather folder. He stepped out from behind the wooden podium. He walked to the very edge of the stage, towering over the front row, looking directly down at my father in his faded gray suit. "There is a pervasive myth," General Vance said, his voice dropping into a quiet, deadly serious register that carried to the very back of the silent hangar. "People think modern warfare is sterile. They think it is just technology and screens. They think the machine does the fighting." My father stood perfectly still, his face completely ashen. "But I want to be entirely clear about what happened in that valley," the general said. This pilot held station over a surrounded platoon under sustained ground fire until every soldier made it out. She absorbed the risk so they would not have to. The general let the heavy silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. "I would ask any infantryman in this room," General Vance challenged, his voice suddenly sharp, echoing with absolute authority, "whether they served 50 years ago in the jungle or yesterday in the desert. I would ask them to look at what this pilot did and tell me if they think that is a video game. I would ask them if they think that is fake war." The absolute silence in the hangar was deafening. No one moved. No one coughed. My father was utterly shattered. The heavy armor he had worn for decades, the arrogant myth he had built to protect his own suffering and diminish my service, had just been publicly dismantled by a legendary combat commander. He realized in one devastating moment that the daughter he had belittled on the patio had willingly thrown herself into the exact same terrifying hell he had barely survived. He had nothing left to say. "Major Miller, step forward," the general ordered. I marched precisely to the center of the stage. The general took the heavy bronze cross from a velvet tray held by an aide and pinned it to my uniform. "Outstanding work, Major," he whispered quietly so only I could hear. "Thank you for bringing them home." He stepped back and rendered a sharp salute. I returned it. "Publish the orders," the general commanded. The massive hangar suddenly erupted. 1,000 airmen broke protocol and began applauding a roaring wave of sound that shook the steel rafters. But I ignored the crowd. I did not look at the sea of blue uniforms. I looked straight down at the front row, watching my father, who had gone completely pale, and was staring back at me in stunned, trembling silence. The ceremony concluded with the traditional playing of the Air Force song. The massive formation was dismissed, and the hangar quickly dissolved into a loud, crowded reception. Hundreds of airmen milled around the polished F-35A, shaking hands, holding coffee cups, and taking photographs. I was immediately surrounded by my squadron mates, my commanders, and their families. It took me nearly 20 minutes to politely navigate through the heavy crowd of blue uniforms to reach the front row. When I finally got there, the padded chairs were empty. My husband and Tyler were standing near the open hangar doors waiting for me, but my father was nowhere to be found. My husband quietly explained that my father had walked out of the hangar the exact moment the formation was dismissed. He had gone straight back to the rental car and was sitting alone in the parking lot. A younger, more arrogant version of myself might have marched out into that baking asphalt lot, pulled open the passenger door, and demanded an apology. I could have shoved the bronze medal in his face and pointed out exactly how wrong he had been, right in front of the teenager he had tried to sway. I did not. In military aviation, we are taught that when a threat is neutralized, you stop firing. You reset. You stabilize the aircraft and check your fuel. You do not waste vital energy on unnecessary emotional maneuvers. My father's toxic myth about my service had been completely neutralized by a Brigadier General in front of 1,000 witnesses. His defensive armor was shattered. He was already disarmed. I did not need to humiliate him just to make myself feel taller. The drive back to my house was completely silent. My father stared out the passenger window the entire time, his hands folded stiffly in his lap, the heavy gray suit jacket draped over his arm. That evening, the house felt quiet. The celebration dinner we had planned was subdued, but in a respectful, necessary way. After we ate, Tyler pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was clearing plates. The teenager who had been so easily embarrassed by my father's dismissal just a few days ago now looked at me with total, unshakable focus. He told me he was absolutely going to enlist. He did not want to just play a simulator. He wanted to be exactly like the people he had seen standing at attention in that hangar. I shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and told him I would be deeply honored to swear him in when the time came. Around 10 o'clock that night, I noticed the sliding glass door to the backyard was open. I walked out onto the patio. The Utah air had finally cooled off, and the crickets were loud in the dry grass. My father was sitting in his aluminum lawn chair in the dark, still wearing his white dress shirt with the collar unbuttoned. He was holding a glass of ice water, just staring out at the dark outline of the Wasatch Mountains. I walked over and sat down in the chair next to him. I did not say anything. I simply sat with him in the dark. For 10 long minutes, the only sound was the distant wind moving through the trees and the faint clinking of the ice in his glass. Then my father leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "I spent 50 years, he whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet night, "trying to convince myself that nobody else would ever have to know what a dark valley feels like." He swallowed hard, keeping his eyes fixed on the grass. "When I came back in 1969, he continued, I was so incredibly angry. I was angry that the world just kept turning while my friends were buried in the mud. I wrapped myself in that anger. I made it my entire identity. I thought that if I was the one who truly understood the absolute worst of war, then it meant my suffering mattered. If everyone else was just wearing a costume and playing a game, then I was still guarding the perimeter. I was still the only one awake." He finally turned and looked at me. The arrogant, dismissive old man from the barbecue was completely gone. In his place was a tired, heartbroken 19-year-old infantryman who had finally stopped fighting a war that had ended decades ago. "I was terrified for you," he said, his eyes watering in the dim porch light. When you told me you were flying combat missions, I told myself you were just flying a desk in the sky, because the alternative was accepting that my own daughter was out there in the dark, getting shot at, and I was completely powerless to protect her." He reached out with a trembling hand. "I belittled you," he choked out, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I mocked your uniform, and all the while you were flying straight into the exact same hell that broke me, just so some terrified boys on the ground could go home to their mothers." He dropped his head into his hands and began to quietly weep. "I am so sorry, Sarah," he cried softly. "I am so terribly sorry." I reached out and placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. "I know, Dad," I said quietly. "I know." We did not talk about the video game comment again. We did not need to litigate the past. Instead, we sat on that patio until 2 a.m. For the very first time in my 36 years of life, my father told me a real story about his time in the Central Highlands. He told me the names of the men in his platoon. He told me what they laughed about and what they feared. And in return, I told him what the sky looks like when the sun comes up over a foreign desert after a long, terrifying night. 2 different wars, 2 different generations, one shared quiet peace. My father flew home the next morning. When he hugged me at the airport terminal, he did not just hug his daughter. He hugged a fellow veteran. The respect in his eyes was absolute, and it was earned the right way. Not with a bitter argument on a patio, but with the undeniable silent weight of truth. Sometimes the heaviest armor a veteran wears is their own pride. When they lash out, when they gatekeep valor, or diminish the sacrifices of younger generations, it is not always rooted in malice. Sometimes it is just untreated grief masking itself as arrogance. We can choose to fight them and tear down their walls, or we can simply stand our ground, keep our military bearing, and let the truth do the heavy lifting for us. Should older veterans get more grace for comments like this, given the invisible weight of what they carry? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you found value in this story, hit the subscribe button for more stories about earning respect across generations. I will see you in the next one.